Thank you, Carrie. Good morning. Will you give her another hand? I was trying to figure out when I was here last. Did we decide it was January, February? We didn't decide. Okay. So, last time I was here, something happened in my life, and I think I shared it with some of you. My home flooded in January, and my pipes had frozen and burst. Do you remember the story? The cascade, the waterfall in my house? Well, that has continued for 8 months of rebuilding and repurposing what once was. It's not been an easy transition, as you can imagine. I lost a lot of material things. I lost a lot of my life's work. And as you heard from Dee's description of my bio, my entire career has shifted. I am no longer doing hospice and palliative care. And that is a brand new thing in my life, because through the transition period of losing everything and trying to rebuild, I also lost my mind. I lost a bit of my health. I ended up in the hospital 2 different times with, when something like that happens, it just sucks the life out of you almost. And what happened is it sucked the vitamins and minerals out of my being. My vitamin D went from a 70 to a 4. And I had to be infused with vitamins and hydration just to be able to figure out where I was. And with that, when I went back to my hospice gig, I realized everything has changed. There was a point at which I understood that I needed to resign from doing what I had been doing for the last 2 decades of my life, but I didn't know what was coming that I could do. And I stepped out, and I'd love to tell you I stepped out in faith, but I stepped out in total fear, and just knowing that it was time to do something different. When I lost everything in my home, I also lost what I would call some faith or trust, because my focus was not on a new beginning, but rather only on what was or had ended. And I think that every major transition in our life experience requires our undivided attention and time for this successful passage into the new. And each one also presents a gift, if only we can hear it and see it. But trust me when I tell you, I saw no gift happening in the midst of all of that. I had contractors and decorators and friends coming in and saying, "It's going to be so much fun to rebuild and redecorate." I still am not having fun with any of that. But I am trusting that the fun will come as soon as I can go furniture shopping and get the new stuff in. We just had new floors laid last week. I haven't even walked on them yet. But in that transitional period, something that was very unexpected in my life has created that sense of knowing that I can look back on life and know that I've always been okay. You know, when you're in your 20s, there's a lot of worry and anxiety. But when you age, that's another gift, is that you can look back and say, yeah, I went through this and that and this and that, and I'm still here. I'm still able to kind of chug along. And that's the thing. Everything has the same thing in common. It all had a beginning, and it will all have an end. The length of time as we measure it between that beginning and that end can be measured in a millisecond of a second or by 1,000,000 years. It matters not. But every form of physical life has a beginning and an end. And within the experience of our human lifetime, we have innumerable beginnings and endings. Each breath, each relationship, each new day is just that. And our physical body, too, has a beginning, and it will have a physical end. So you can think about all of those as a beginning is much like a birth, and the end is a type of death. And although those new beginnings are usually something that we prefer over the endings of our life, we have to remember that every new beginning requires an ending first. Have you noticed that? You know, we live in a part of the country where you have 4 seasons, and you're able to see in nature the beginning, the end, the beginning, the end. Likewise, reaping a harvest can be preferred over all of the work that goes into that harvest, all the planting and the turning and the toiling that is created in that season before we get to that harvest. But we can't enjoy the harvest without all of the work that we put into it. And the transitional storms of our life are necessary to clear that atmosphere of our old way of thinking, of our old belief system, of our old life. Because everything is made new again. Khalil Gibran, a poet and mystic that I often read, and I wish I could say I got this from his book, but I can't because that book floated away in the flood. So I looked it up this morning, and here's one of my favorite passages that he says. When you reach the end of what you should know, you will be at the beginning of what you should sense. Then comes a new knowing. I love that. We in this Western world are generally not very comfortable with death of any kind, right? We are not celebrating our endings like we celebrate our beginnings. We deny and lament those endings. We rejoice at a birth, but we see tragedy in death. We celebrate a wedding, but we only see the finality or the failure in a divorce. But if you've been through divorce, you know that there is a season at which you say, oh, but that was such a great beginning too. And I was honored to give a graduation speech just a few months ago. And it was so interesting as I was taking the stage to do that, I realized that this is the ending for an era for these students, for these kids. And yet they introduced me and said, now the commencement speech. It is just that. It's boom, 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 one after the other. The same happened for me in my career recently. 20 years doing the same thing of hospice, palliative care, bereavement, grief, came to an abrupt end. Not because it had to in a manifestational aspect that I was fired or that I knew it was coming. It had to for me to begin again in my own journey of life. Some of the most quoted words of our Bible come from the book of Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, and you have all heard this. You have sang it with the Beatles, but I'm going to read it again for you, and I want you to hear it with new ears. I want you to really pay attention as if it were for the first time. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather up stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent, a time to speak, a time to love, a time to fear, a time for war, and a time for peace. That entire scripture is now written on my bathroom mirror in eyeliner pencil as my reminder that there is a time for every season. And the understanding that that list represents all of the seasons and all that's important and that matters in our life experience. Some are happy times, some are sad. Some are productive and others seem wasteful. Some are inspiring peace and others bring pain. But all of them are necessary for us to learn and to grow and to evolve as spiritual beings. The appearance of those things is not by accident, because I think if we look closely enough, each experience reveals to us this loving divine purpose that we can learn to trust. Trust is a big word for me. I have told you about truth and that you can spell it two ways with a little t and a capital T. Trust is the same. I grew up in a very religious household and we use the word faith. And it's much the same vibration. I'm just preferring today to use the word trust. It is the understanding that the flow of life is this process of change, ever evolving, ever unfolding. And we can learn to accept that process and go with the flow of that change, or we can deny or resist it. The easier way out, however, is always to go with the flow. I mean, you can try to resist it and stop it, but it's not stopping. I noticed that with the water cascading down my house. Even when I turned the water off, the water was still flowing. And then it began to flow up into the walls. It was just sucked up into the drywall. Sometimes the challenges that we encounter seem like these dark tunnels. I was traveling in Chicago and in Colorado recently, driving through tunnels. I have midwifed countless people off of this planet who go through this tunnel. But the promise or the gift at the end of each of those tunnels is the light. And when we think about every tunnel having a light at the end, as we are groping around in the darkness, we can focus on that faint light at the end of it and see in the distance. That light represents that gift. That light is our awareness that there's something else to learn, our awareness that we are growing, our awareness that we have the chance to heal or change. The darkness is going to pass, and we move toward that light, and we gratefully receive it. There is the gift, and what I just said is so important because it's in the receiving mode of that gift that everything blossoms. 25 years ago, I was selling real estate. I was a realtor. My first transaction, I sold a house to a very young couple. It was their first starter home. And at the closing table, their parents had given them a $10,000 gift for their first home. And interestingly enough, because I was such a newbie, I didn't know this was going to happen, the closer actually slid a piece of paper across the closing table and said, "You have to sign this in order to receive that gift." There is actually a law of the land that says this: a gift is not a gift until it is received. I want you to think about that. How many times have you bought a gift at Christmas or birthday, and then you didn't see that person, and it ends up in your closet or on the dining room table for 3 months until you see them? You're calling it a gift, but it's not a gift to them until it's received by them, right? A gift is not a gift until it's received. The thing is, nothing in life is static for very long. Have you noticed that? The late Unity minister and teacher Eric Butterworth, who I hope you have read his books or listened to him, he often explained this process of life as this: there is a time for growth and a time to go. And they are always together. As soon as we grow to that next higher level in our evolutionary consciousness, it's time to go to that next level. In Unity, it's our 5th unity principle. It's one thing to know all of this stuff that we talk about day in and day out, but it's another thing to be in the action of it, to take it forth and to go with that truth and that understanding. But when crisis comes, resistance is usually our first human response. And that is not going. That is being stuck right there, trying to control it, trying to hold it at bay. And that resistance can sometimes feel very self-protective, but in the long run, it's self-destructive. It becomes self-destructive with every crisis because in any given moment, in any crisis, there is the consciousness of choice. But sometimes we don't choose to go forth. And to resist or to allow, to respond in fear or in trust, to say yes or to no, is this unlimited consciousness of choice always available to us. But sometimes we don't choose either, and we just get stuck right there. We call that shock, trauma, numbness, whatever that is. When I saw that water cascading down my walls, I couldn't believe it. I could hear it, I could see it, I could smell it, I could taste it. When I walked across the carpet that was still floating, I could feel it. I just didn't believe it. And it took me several weeks to believe that this had happened. Certainly there is so much that is good and true that is contained in our societal customs, yet often it's our conventional wisdom that only contains half-truths. We are stuck in the between place, if you will. And as we discover that there is a gift in every season, we learn that we can trust that loving presence, that divine purpose behind it, that current of life that's carrying us to a new adventure. But that's where the fear often comes up, isn't it? I'm not ready. I'm a little scared to take that step. I don't have the wherewithal. I don't have the finances. I don't, whatever that is. I've said it on this stage before, and I will probably say it to my dying breath. There is no pain in change. There is only pain in our resistance to change. That is the biggest life lesson I think I've ever learned. And most of us are not handling that change or these endings in our life experience very well. We have a tendency to do one of two things. We either understate it or overstate it. And there's importance in each of the endings, just as there is in each beginning. And when we think about the importance of an ending that's understated in our vocabulary, in our mind, we fail to acknowledge the impact that it has on our life. We discount or minimize the effect it has. We make statements like, let's forget about the past and move on. Let's let go and let God, that God up there, out there. But the truth is, those statements can be valid in a certain context, but much of the time it's simply a cliche that we're saying or using to deny our true feeling about an ending. As I mentioned before, our culture has adopted somewhat of this mechanical robot system within us. We want everything instantaneous. Everything in my home, because of the water that went into the electrical system, everything blew up. If it was plugged in, it no longer works. And I went out and got a new microwave because, man's got to eat. So I realized in those moments of eating fast food and trying to figure out how to, make dinner in a microwave, I wanted it instantaneously, and I got very used to that very quickly. And I drove through the drive-thru one day, and they just didn't have my order ready in time. It'd been a minute and 30 seconds. And so we have to think about these endings. Sometimes they are unexpected, and sometimes we can see them coming. But that understating it takes away the significance of it. But likewise, to overstate it is just as detrimental to our experience. I did a funeral yesterday. I'm going to do another one Tuesday. And you've all been to these same experiences, whether they're celebrations of life or funerals, where you're sitting in that service and the people get up to talk about that person and you're just like, who are they talking about? Because all of a sudden they're a saint among men. And you were just out with them 3 weeks ago and they were not very saintly. We've all had those experiences. And it is that overstatement of an ending that causes this untruth to come into play. You know, it's kind of the Romeo and Juliet experience. It is the lover who throws himself over a cliff because his sweetheart has rejected him. It's the millionaire who jumps off a bridge because he's lost his fortune. I mean, those are some pretty dramatic ways of overstating a loss or an ending. But at the same time, we can see an ending as an absolute finality to something or someone rather than a beginning of a transition process. And sometimes we just take both of them a little too seriously. We overstate the importance of those endings when we perceive that there is going to be emptiness or meaninglessness without that person, place, or thing. Because we have believed that that permanent condition is just that, permanent. It is to a degree, but not in physical form, rather in the spiritual realm. But if we're living in that physical place, not seeing with the eyes of spirit, but rather only seeing with the eyes of our humanness, we see the loss. We feel the loss. Now, in one sense, every loss is permanent. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it loss. But to be sure, that person who has died is gone permanently only in physical form. And the relationship that we end, whether that's through divorce or breakup or moving, whatever the case may be, is over compared to what it was before. That lost circumstance of our life never will truly be exactly the same. However, what is not lost is the possibility of the new beginning. What is not lost is the ability to live and love and enjoy life anew, because that taught us something. That brought us to this place so that we can take that next step into who and what we are becoming. And we can honor our births and our beginnings day in and day out. We celebrate them. But we deny and dishonor our endings. And I think we've got that a little mixed up. One of my favorite unity ministers, and he's an author, Robert Brummett, once said this: to worship an ending is to give it more power than it deserves, to make it bigger than you are. But to honor an ending is to acknowledge the impact that it had on your life, to honor the people and the experiences that brought you together, to honor the divine wisdom and order that governs every aspect of your life, if only you had the right eyes to see it. It is our nature to turn to the God of our understanding during any difficult time, any transitional passage in our life. Ironically, this is often a time when our faith or our trust in everything, including that God of our understanding, is shaken. And if we can but realize the possibility of an entirely new understanding of God in that new beginning, wow, there's the gift. Because the God that brought you thus far is the God you believed in then, but the God that's going to move you forward is a much bigger God, because guess what? You are much bigger in consciousness. You're much bigger in your understanding. You're much bigger in your awareness of what's important and what's not. I was paying someone really good money to dust a whole lot of stuff at my house. And that stuff doesn't even exist anymore. So unfortunately, one person's out of a job. But the greater importance or significance is that what I thought mattered and needed to be dusted every week no longer exists. And guess what? I am still working on an inventory loss sheet for the insurance companies. I cannot even remember what was in that drawer. I can't remember what was in that closet. So I know I'm on camera and I'm not going to say I'm making stuff up. But it's really interesting to realize what you thought was important didn't have the same significance as you believed. In his book, Robert Brumet often explains these 3 distinct stages for any transition in our life. And I've talked about them on this stage before. But he says, number 1, each transition begins with an ending, something or someone that we have to let go of before we can start anew. Number 2 is that ending comes with a void, a time of grief, a time of disorientation, a time of eventually accepting where we are. And then third, we then are able to begin anew. So first, that change entails all the separation, the loss from our old way of life. Second, we are ushered to that threshold moment where we knew what was, we just don't know what will be. And then it paves the way for our return to something new. And that something new is not outside of us. That something new is who and what we are becoming. And so I was with my friend Bukeka a couple of weeks ago, and as Dee mentioned, we will be here in October. I hope you'll join us for our retreat. Bukeka has been companioning me through this journey of loss, and she recently lost her mother, so we have been companioning each other through a season. And Bukeka likes to quote one scripture day in and day out. It's her favorite one. It comes from the book of Romans, and this is what it says. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can discern what is the will of God, meaning what is good and perfect. That's a clear and direct statement about the interaction in us between our spiritual nature and our human experience. It really defines our entire purpose as spiritual beings engaged in this mortal experience. We become conformed to this world when we allow the illusions of separation or loss, the lack and limitation to become the energy that motivates those choices that I talked about. We are transformed, however, when in the midst of that human experience, we remember the truth of who and what we are. The Christ consciousness, that understanding that we can allow that truth to shape our choices. That transformation can only happen when we truly believe in our innate oneness with that Spirit or that God. I think becoming transformed is really the entire purpose of our human experience. And it often takes some unbridled chaos in our life to indicate the beginning of a great transformation. Change is always, did I mention always? Change is always preceded by a momentum of energy beyond all illusion of control. I think I'm a good driver. Does that mean I'm safe on the highway? No, because there's a million other people who aren't good drivers. But when you look at the daily word that I chose today that's printed on the front of your bulletin, I hope you'll pin that to your refrigerator when you get home. Because you can pray it for yourself or pray it for me, it matters not. Life constantly moves me forward in a journey of spiritual growth and practice. We know that to be true. It goes on to say, sometimes I yearn for something more. We plant those seeds. We believe in the gift that is coming. Perhaps it's an inner whisper that urges me to explore a greater depth, or a life-changing event that thrusts me into a new chapter of life. So if you're in the midst of change, unwanted or planned, I want you to think about where you are in the midst of it. Are you resisting it or allowing it? As I mentioned, trust and faith are closely aligned. And they are both based on knowledge of what we have known in our past. I trust a lot of things. I trust a lot of laws. I trust in the law of gravity. I trust in the law of attraction. I trust in the law of prosperity. Why am I not trusting in the law of cause and effect? Because it too is just as real. And there are objective and discernible laws of our inner world just as there are of the external world. I don't simply trust the law of gravity, I know the law of gravity. So trusting that spiritual law is simply knowing that any love we put out into the universe is going to come back to us. That's the way it happens. That is the law of attraction. It has been said that faith is blind. I've been sitting with that, and I am just not a believer in that anymore. I believe that faith is visionary. It's the very opposite. I believe that trust is our vision if we will allow it. And this universe that we're living in is very self-organizing and self-correcting. We just sang about it. Confident living rights every wrong. And our job is to surrender, to relax into the arms of that trust, God, love, whatever name you want to give it, and to enjoy the ride. Because trust me, when you're not enjoying the ride, there is your greatest understanding of resistance. Just like the acorn that has to die in order to be reborn as an oak tree, we are all in the midst of being transformed, individually, collectively, day in and day out. And with that transformation, we become more compassionate, more loving, more caring people who offer our own unique gifts to the rest of the world, but also to our own soul. Change offers us that possibility, that gift of growing beyond our perceived limitations to the fullness of our divine potential. And whether it is an unwanted circumstance that happens to us or something that we initiate voluntarily, change is an invitation to actualize the wisdom and the compassion that is our gift. It makes us both fully human, and it is the evidence of our manifestations of divine living. Life is, after all, a journey. It's a journey into the unknown, where change is the only constant. And as I was thinking about something to end with today, one of my favorite authors is Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching. And he says this: the key to growth is the introduction of a higher dimension of consciousness into our awareness. He went on to say, when I let go of what I am, I become who and what I might be. Our challenge is to pay attention. Our challenge is to heal what needs to be healed, to grieve what has been lost as a testimony to how precious it was. Our challenge is, as Carrie just sang about, to rise up in consciousness, to shine our light. It's not our individual human light, but it's the light of that Christ within us. When we can see through not the eyes of our humanness, but through the eyes of our source, our God, we can see those gifts beyond our limited human perspective. We can hear, not with these ears, but with our heart. And then we can know, beyond a shadow of a doubt. and stay faithful and trusting to the certainty that we live in a spiritually meaningful existence where we can receive those gifts, but they're not a gift until we do so. And those gifts are things like peace and love and harmony. And from that, we grow and we go into that next chapter. As Carrie said, we bring darkness into the light, where we live, where we move, where we have our being. Because wherever we are, God is, and all is well. Thank you for having me. Namaste.